Hi, I'm Diane de Vignemont. I'm a journalist and historian in residence at France-Amérique Magazine, and this year we're celebrating our 80th anniversary. Most of you may not know, but France-Amérique was actually founded in 1943 in New York City, during what philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called the Battle of New York. So to understand the 1943 Battle of New York, you actually have to go all the way back to 1940. In 1940, France was occupied by the Nazis. To make a long story short, Marshal Pétain and the French state signed an armistice with the occupying forces, and the south of France became a shadow sovereign state that eventually ended up collaborating with the Nazi occupier, and the north was occupied. Charles de Gaulle, who was in London, refused to accept the armistice, and he founded what would eventually become Free France, so the French resistance in exile. So what most people don't know, though, is that Free France and the French resistance wasn't only in London, it was actually all over the world, from Australia to Latin America, and a lot of them were actually in New York City, because in the late 30s and the early 40s, as the Germans started coming towards France and as the Nazi rule became increasingly prominent in Europe, a lot of Jews, a lot of artists, a lot of journalists and activists who had resisted early on against the Nazi regime actually had to flee Europe, and a lot of them came to America. And so in the 40s, when France signed the armistice and when de Gaulle makes his famous appeal to resistance, there's actually a ton of French people in New York City already, but they don't have any French language press to tell them about what's been happening, to tell them what's going to happen, and so there's this real dearth of French media, of French news in New York City. And so as a result, you have a lot of very different French groups trying to be the first, trying to be the most important French media in the United States. So Vichy creates its own newspaper in America, because most people don't know this, but the Americans actually kept a Vichy embassy in DC and in New York City well into 1942. And so Free France had a real hard time implementing its legitimacy and its actual sovereignty in the US. And so one of the ways they did that was through media. And France-Amérique was born out of this desire to express French thought and to express French sovereignty in the United States. And so in 1943, France-Amérique was born out of a newspaper that already existed that was called L'Amérique. And L'Amérique was bought by the Free French delegation on Fifth Avenue, and it was reworked into France-Amérique. And from that point on, instead of being sort of wait and see, cultural, literal magazine, it became an actively political and militant newspaper. And day after day, it would relay the news from France, from occupied Europe. It would have sort of like a kill list, say how many Germans were murdered today by the French resistance, how many French resistors were executed, what victory did the Free French forces win in Libya or in Lebanon. And so it became a very, very actively Gaullist, a fervently Gaullist, as the editor said, newspaper. And throughout the war, it would keep this activism alive to make sure that Free France and the French resistance were very much accepted in the United States, to make sure that when the war ended, France would actually have a seat at the victor's table, because it was, much like the United States, much like England, one of the Allied powers, and press was very much a way to do this. And France-Amérique has changed a lot since then. It's no longer a weekly newspaper, it's a monthly magazine. But one thing that is still very much true about France-Amérique is that it strives to explain French culture, French political life, French lifestyle to an American audience 80 years later.